Diver found strange rocket attached under a bridge. When police cut it open, everyone froze. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the quiet town. The early morning mist clung to the surface of the water, making everything appear hazy and mysterious. The bridge stood tall over the river, its concrete structure weathered by time. This was a spot many locals knew well, a bridge that connected two parts of the town, but it was rarely used. Most people drove around it, preferring to take a longer route if they needed to cross the river. Over the years, the area had become a bit of a hidden gem for those looking for a quiet escape. But for one man, the bridge was something entirely different. Mark Davies had been diving in these waters for years. He wasn't a professional diver, nor did he have any particular fame, but he loved the peace it gave him. Mark was the type of person who thrived in solitude. Whether it was swimming, diving, or simply sitting by the river, he found solace in the sounds of the water and the rhythm of the world moving around him. He wasn't there for any big reason that morning. He had no particular mission or purpose, just the need to clear his mind. Mark had always been fond of exploring underwater, especially near the bridge. The water was always calm in the morning hours, and the visibility wasn't bad either, as long as you stayed close to the riverbanks. He often spent hours underwater, inspecting the stones, plants, and abandoned objects that had slowly settled on the riverbed. Sometimes he would come across an old bike or a lost tool, things that had been discarded by others or had simply slipped away from sight over the years. That morning, Mark lowered himself into the cool water, the chill of the river refreshing against his skin. As he swam under the bridge, his focus was on the usual spots where objects might have been left. He passed by the familiar rocks and pieces of wood, his body moving effortlessly through the water. The current was gentle, and he felt at peace. It was just another dive, another quiet moment in the water. But then, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another discarded piece of debris, maybe a rusted barrel or an old piece of scrap metal. However, as he drew closer, Mark realized that it was something much stranger. He stopped swimming and hovered in the water, his body floating just above the riverbed. There, lodged between two large rocks, was a strange, cylindrical object. It was about 6 feet long, with smooth, metallic surfaces that glinted under the water's surface. The design was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Mark reached out carefully, his fingers brushing against the object. The object was secured to the rocks, fastened by what looked like thick metal straps. There was something about it that made Mark pause. It didn't belong here. It wasn't like the usual litter he had found in the past. This was something that looked intentional, something that had been placed there on purpose. His curiosity piqued. Mark studied the object more closely. It didn't appear to be a simple piece of trash or even an abandoned vehicle part. There were markings along its surface, almost as though they were etched into the metal. They were complex and unfamiliar. He tried to make sense of them, but couldn't. They didn't resemble any language he knew, nor did they look like any symbols he had ever seen before. A rush of thoughts flooded his mind. Could it be some kind of military equipment? Had it been part of a test or an experiment? The idea of it being some sort of rocket or missile crossed his mind, but that felt too far-fetched. After all, this was a quiet, remote area. Mark had never heard of anything like that in the vicinity. But then again, there were so many things about the world that most people never understood. He carefully swam around the object, his eyes scanning every detail. The object didn't appear to be leaking any fluids, and there was no sign of damage or explosion. It looked intact, but still, the mystery lingered. What was this thing, and how had it ended up in this spot? Mark's heart raced as the adrenaline of discovery began to set in. He wasn't sure why he felt so nervous, but the object was unlike anything he had ever encountered before. As much as he wanted to stay and investigate further, something told him that it was better to leave it to the authorities. This was beyond his expertise. He wasn't trained to handle potentially dangerous or classified objects. He took a few more moments to observe the object, considering his next move. Finally, he made up his mind. Carefully, he swam back to the surface, his mind still buzzing with questions. As he pulled himself onto the shore, he took out his phone, his hands shaking slightly. He snapped a quick picture of the object, knowing that he needed evidence before he reported it. Mark's heart was still racing as he walked along the bank of the river, away from the bridge. His mind swirled with theories and possibilities, but deep down, he knew he had to alert someone about what he had found. This was bigger than just an interesting discovery. It could be something dangerous. Or maybe it was simply a relic from the past. Either way, it wasn't something he could ignore. As he dialed the local police, Mark's thoughts raced. The officer on the other end of the line answered with a polite, "Hello, how can I help you?" "Hi," Mark began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm out by the old bridge, you know, the one by the river. I've just come across something strange under the water. I think you might want to check it out." There was a brief silence on the other end before the officer responded. "What do you mean, something strange?" It's hard to describe," Mark said. "It looks like some kind of object. It's cylindrical, metallic, and it's fastened to the rocks under the bridge. I don't know what it is, but it's not like anything I've seen before." The officer didn't waste any time. "All right, stay where you are. We'll send someone out to check it out. Don't touch it and stay safe. We'll have someone there soon." Mark nodded, though the officer couldn't see him. He didn't know why, but he felt a little better knowing the authorities would take care of it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just an old piece of forgotten equipment, but deep down he felt that something wasn't right. Whatever it was better left to the experts. He walked back to the bridge, sitting on the bank of the river and waiting for the authorities to arrive. His thoughts kept going back to the object beneath the water, and as he sat there, a sinking feeling began to settle in his stomach. He had found something that could be much more significant than he had first thought. And soon, the whole town would know. It wasn't long before the sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance. Mark stood by the riverbank, his mind racing with thoughts of what could happen next. The sun had now fully risen, casting a bright light over the water, which only made the mysterious object beneath the bridge seem even more out of place. The calm, serene environment felt almost ironic, given the strange nature of what he had just discovered. As Mark watched the river, he could still picture the object in his mind. Its sleek metallic surface, the strange symbols etched into its casing, and how it had been wedged between the rocks. It was as if the object had been left there intentionally, hidden away from the world, and now he had stumbled upon it. He wondered who had placed it there and why, but those questions would have to wait. He had done his part by calling the authorities, and now it was up to them to figure it out. The police arrived shortly after, their vehicles pulling up along the road that ran parallel to the river. The officers stepped out of their cars and moved toward Mark. He could tell by the serious expressions on their faces that this wasn't just another routine call. They had heard of strange things being found in remote areas before, but this was different. This was not just debris or garbage. Mark could see the concern in their eyes. "Which way?" one of the officers asked, glancing at Mark. "Down this path," Mark replied, pointing toward the small, worn trail that led to the bridge. "It's just under the bridge between the rocks." The officers nodded and followed him down the path. As they walked, Mark's mind was still filled with thoughts of the object. What could it possibly be? He tried to make sense of the situation, but nothing added up. He had seen military equipment before, and he knew that this wasn't anything like that. This was something entirely different, something that didn't belong in a quiet river near a small town. When they reached the spot where Mark had first discovered the object, the officers stopped in their tracks. They looked at each other, clearly surprised by the sight. The water was still, and the sunlight illuminated the area, casting reflections across the surface of the river. But the object beneath the bridge was unmistakable. It was exactly as Mark had described. A cylindrical shape, metallic and gleaming under the water, partially hidden by the rocks. One of the officers pulled out a pair of binoculars, focusing on the object. "What is that?" he muttered to himself, his voice filled with curiosity and disbelief. Mark didn't know how to respond. "I have no idea," he said honestly. "I just found it. I didn't touch it, didn't move it. I thought you guys should take a look." The officers stood there for a moment, considering their options. Then, without saying much more, they began to discuss the next steps. "We'll need to call the bomb squad," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. The other officer nodded, pulling out his radio to make the call. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had a sinking feeling that whatever was under that bridge might not be just some abandoned object. The officer's reaction confirmed his fears. Something about it didn't sit right, and he wasn't the only one who felt that way. As the officers spoke into their radios, Mark noticed that more vehicles were arriving. He recognized the familiar black and yellow markings of the local bomb squad vehicle as it pulled up. The officers quickly made their way over to the truck, and a group of specialists emerged, suited up in their protective gear. They wasted no time in getting organized. Mark stepped back, standing on the riverbank, watching as the professionals moved into action. The bomb squad officers were methodical, calm, and precise. They set up their equipment with practiced ease, their focus entirely on the object beneath the bridge. The area was quickly cordoned off, and a small crowd began to gather on the far side of the road, eager to see what was going on. Mark tried to keep his distance, but he couldn't help but watch. His curiosity about the object hadn't waned. In fact, it had only grown. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the professionals as they approached the object. They had brought tools with them, and one of the officers, equipped with a robotic arm, began to carefully inspect the object from a safe distance. The machine moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if it knew the importance of the task at hand. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The professionals were cautious, but Mark could sense that they were beginning to realize that whatever the object was, it could be a serious matter. The robotic arm extended toward the object, and the officer controlling it carefully tapped on the object's surface. There was no immediate reaction. The device didn't explode and no alarms went off. But the officers knew better than to assume everything was safe. One of the bomb squad officers, a woman with short black hair and a serious expression, walked over to Mark. She glanced at him briefly before speaking in a low voice. "Where exactly did you find this?" Mark pointed to the area just beneath the bridge, where the object had been lodged between two large rocks. "Right there," he said, feeling a bit nervous under her gaze. She nodded, taking a mental note of the spot before turning to walk back toward her team. By now, the scene had begun to draw a small crowd. The local news station had shown up, and reporters were setting up cameras to capture the unfolding events. Mark could hear snippets of their conversations, some speculating that the object was a piece of lost military equipment, others suggesting it could be a piece of space debris that had somehow ended up in the river. Mark couldn't help but overhear their voices and wonder if anyone could truly guess what this thing was. The police, standing nearby, continued to keep the crowd at bay, but even they seemed as intrigued as everyone else. Mark overheard a few officers discussing the object in low voices, their words filled with uncertainty. It was clear that none of them had ever seen anything like this before. After several minutes of tense silence, the bomb squad officers made a decision. They were going to attempt to cut open the object carefully. They set up a high-powered laser cutter, the tool humming as it powered up. The anticipation in the air was almost palpable. Mark watched, holding his breath, as the officers prepared to make the incision. He felt a strange sense of dread settle over him. What would they find inside? Was this something dangerous? Or was it something harmless, lost and forgotten in the depths of the river for years? The sound of the cutter's blade slicing into the object filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, as the first layer of the mysterious object was breached. Mark stood there, staring, as the strange and silent object began to open, unaware that the moment ahead would soon send shockwaves through the entire town. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the high-powered laser cutter filled the air as the bomb squad officers carefully maneuvered the tool around the object. Mark stood at a distance, his heart pounding as he watched, hoping that everything would go smoothly. The laser made a thin, controlled cut along the metal surface of the strange object, slicing through the casing with precision. Every second felt like an eternity. The crowd that had gathered across the road watched intently, whispering among themselves, but no one dared to move too close. The police kept everyone at bay, ensuring that the scene remained secure. Mark felt an odd mix of relief and unease. Part of him wanted to run over and see what was happening firsthand, but he knew better than to get too close. The professionals were handling it, and he had done his part by reporting the find. The bomb squad officer operating the laser cutter was methodical, her eyes focused on the object, her every move deliberate. As the cutter continued its work, the metallic smell of burned metal wafted through the air. The casing slowly began to give way, revealing the inside of the object, but there was no explosion, no sudden burst of dangerous energy. Instead, The officers worked with an intense focus, knowing that even the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Mark watched, holding his breath. With each inch that the cutter sliced through, the suspense grew. What would be inside? Could it be something harmless? Maybe just an old piece of equipment lost to time? Or was it something more? The sheer mystery of it all was enough to make anyone's mind race. The officer in charge of the operation looked up from her work for a brief moment, making eye contact with her team. Without speaking a word, they nodded in unison, as if they were all on the same page. The cutter had now made its way halfway around the object, revealing a dark interior that Mark couldn't quite make out from where he stood. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The object was slowly but surely being opened, revealing more of its strange, hidden components. Mark felt a growing sense of curiosity and apprehension. What was inside that strange cylinder? Could it be something that would explain its existence, or was it a mystery that would only deepen once it was fully exposed? As the cutter finished its work, the officers stepped back, giving the object a moment to cool down. The air was still thick with tension. Mark felt a pit in his stomach as he realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The object had been cut open, but it wasn't over yet. There was still a long way to go before they could truly understand what they were dealing with. A few of the officers donned protective gloves, their movements slow and calculated as they approached the now open object. Mark couldn't see much from his position, but he could tell that the object was filled with strange, unfamiliar components. There were wires and panels, some of which appeared to have labels that made no sense to him. The markings on the inside were just as cryptic as those on the outer surface. None of it looked familiar. It was nothing like any device or piece of technology that Mark had ever encountered. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, leaned in closer, inspecting the inner workings. His brow furrowed as he examined the components. "This is unusual," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Mark couldn't make out what he was saying, but it was clear that he was just as baffled by the object as everyone else. The officer stepped back, pulling out a small flashlight and shining it into the object. The light flickered across the components, revealing more details. Mark strained his eyes, trying to make sense of what was inside. He could see metal, wires, and what appeared to be some kind of circuit board. It didn't look like any typical piece of technology. It didn't look like a bomb or a weapon, but it didn't look like anything normal either. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" the officer asked his colleague, who was standing next to him. His voice was steady, but Mark could hear the hint of confusion in it. The second officer shook his head. "No, this is something else. I don't know what it is, but it's not something we're used to seeing." As the officers continued to examine the object, Mark's mind raced. What were they seeing? Why were they acting so cautious? They hadn't reacted like this to any ordinary find. Something about this object was clearly unusual, and Mark couldn't help but wonder what kind of implications this discovery might have. Was it something dangerous, something secret? Or was it just a forgotten piece of machinery that had somehow ended up in the river? The officers began to take more careful measurements and document the object's components. They had brought out a small notebook and a few recording devices, taking notes on every detail. Mark could hear them speaking quietly among themselves, but it was all technical jargon that meant little to him. He could tell, though, that they were making a careful record of every part of the object. The bomb squad wasn't taking any chances. A few more minutes passed, and the officers seemed to reach a decision. One of them stepped back and pulled out his radio. Mark watched as he spoke in low, urgent tones. "We need backup. Call in the experts. We're going to need help identifying this thing." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Backup? Experts? This was no longer just a simple find under the bridge. The officers were calling in additional resources, which meant that whatever this object was, it was far more significant than anyone had initially thought. As the minutes ticked by, Mark felt a growing sense of unease. The idea of finding a piece of lost military equipment or old space debris had seemed far-fetched, but it was beginning to look more and more like that's exactly what they had found, or something even stranger. He tried to push away the thoughts racing through his mind, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that this discovery could have far-reaching consequences. If this was something dangerous, something that had been intentionally hidden, then what did that mean for everyone involved? The crowd that had gathered further down the road was starting to get restless. People had begun to speculate loudly about what the object might be, and news reporters were gathering footage, eager to get the first exclusive story. Mark could hear snippets of their conversations, but it wasn't enough to distract him from the seriousness of the situation unfolding before him. The officers continued to take their measurements and document the object, their focus unwavering. As they worked, Mark's thoughts continued to swirl. What if this object wasn't just some forgotten piece of technology? What if it was part of something larger, something more dangerous? What if they had uncovered a mystery that was much bigger than anyone had imagined? At that moment, Mark realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever they were about to uncover, it was clear that it would change everything. And he, of all people, had stumbled upon it first. The seconds ticked by, and as Mark stood there watching the officers work, he knew that life as he knew it was about to take a drastic turn. The mystery had only just begun. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting a bright, unbroken light across the scene. The officers were still hard at work, their faces showing clear signs of concentration. Mark had been standing at the riverbank for what seemed like hours, watching as the team carefully continued their inspection of the strange object beneath the bridge. Every minute that passed only seemed to add more questions than answers. The radio calls had become more frequent now. Backup was on its way, and experts were being called in from other areas. Mark tried to piece together what might be happening, but everything seemed so surreal. What had started as an ordinary morning dive had now turned into an investigation that felt far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The bomb squad officers had continued to carefully examine the object, their tools and equipment now fully deployed. One officer, wearing a full suit of protective gear, was carefully removing wires and taking small samples from inside the object. He moved methodically, as if following a specific procedure. Another officer had a laptop open in front of him, taking notes on the data they were gathering. The information seemed so technical, and Mark was left in the dark, his curiosity growing with each passing second. One of the officers approached Mark, giving him a small nod. "We've called in experts. They'll be here shortly," he said, his voice calm but serious. "In the meantime, we're going to need to secure the area further. Stay clear of the bridge." Mark nodded, understanding the importance of keeping a safe distance. He didn't want to get in the way, but part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something huge, something that would change everything. The thought nagged at him. How had he, a simple diver, ended up discovering something like this? The object under the bridge wasn't just any discarded item. It wasn't a piece of junk or lost equipment. It felt like it was something from a completely different world, something far more important. As Mark stood there, he couldn't help but feel that whatever was about to happen would be far beyond anything he could have expected. A few more minutes passed, and the officers began to move back, their attention focused on the new arrivals. Mark noticed the additional vehicles coming up the road, their sirens flashing in the distance. A few police cars, followed by a black van marked with the words "Special Operations," turned onto the narrow road that led to the bridge. The experts had arrived. The officers quickly made way for the new arrivals, who wasted no time in approaching the object. There were more people now, people in white lab coats, scientists carrying high-tech tools, and experts from various fields. Mark's eyes widened as he watched the team begin to gather around the strange object. The whole area was buzzing with activity now, and the sense of urgency had only grown. One of the scientists, a middle-aged man with glasses, bent down and peered at the object. His fingers traced along the strange symbols that covered its surface. He muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Fascinating. I've never seen anything quite like this." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a lost piece of technology. The words the scientist had said, though quiet, made it clear that the object was something completely out of the ordinary. But what exactly was it? What was the connection between the object and the strange symbols? The scientists continued to inspect the object. They opened compartments that had previously been sealed, carefully analyzing the internal components. They seemed to be particularly interested in one part of the object, a panel that was hidden deep inside. Mark couldn't see what they were looking at, but he could tell by their reactions that they had found something crucial. The minutes stretched on, and Mark felt like he was holding his breath. The team was still working, their focus unwavering. But the longer they took, the more anxious Mark became. There had to be something important inside that object. Why else would they have called in such an elaborate team of experts? The team worked for what felt like an eternity, their movements precise and calculated. Every now and then, one of the scientists would make a remark to his colleagues, pointing out something new that they had discovered. Mark couldn't make sense of the words, but it was clear that this was a high-stakes operation. No one seemed willing to speak to him directly, and the officers still kept a careful watch on the growing crowd that had gathered further down the road. Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the news media would be all over this. The scene had already attracted their attention, and it wouldn't be long before the story went public. As the experts continued their work, Mark's mind drifted back to the moment he had first found the object. It had been such a simple, quiet discovery, a strange, metallic cylinder wedged between the rocks. He had thought it was just another piece of junk, something no one would care about. But the more he looked at it now, the more he realized how wrong he had been. What if the object had been placed there on purpose? What if it wasn't just an accident? Someone had hidden it away for a reason. But who? And why? Mark couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. Was it a government project, some kind of secret military technology? Or was it something entirely different, something that no one had ever seen before? The scientists seemed to be nearing a breakthrough. They had been inspecting the panels inside the object for several minutes now, and Mark could see that they were becoming more animated. The leader of the team, a woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, stood up and turned to face the officers. "We've made a discovery," she said, her voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. "We need to transport this object to a secure location for further analysis. We don't know what we're dealing with here, but it's clear that it's far beyond anything we've encountered before." Mark's heart raced as he heard her words. "What is it?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. The woman looked at him, her expression serious. "I can't say much right now, but we'll be in touch once we know more." With that, she turned back to her team, who quickly began to pack up their equipment. The object was carefully lifted from its resting place and placed onto a secure transport vehicle, covered with a large, opaque tarp. Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. The object was being taken away, but he still had no idea what it was or why it had been placed under the bridge. As the transport vehicle drove off, Mark stood there, watching it disappear in the distance. The officers began to break down their equipment and pack up, but the air was thick with unanswered questions. The story wasn't over, it had only just begun. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been hidden under that bridge was far more significant than anyone had realized. He turned to leave, but a part of him knew that he wouldn't be able to stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. He had stumbled upon something that was far beyond his understanding, and now it was out of his hands. But the mystery remained. And the question that lingered in his mind as he walked away from the scene was simple. What had he really discovered? Days passed since the strange object had been taken away from the bridge, but for Mark, it felt like the world had completely shifted. The mystery of what he had discovered continued to gnaw at him, filling his thoughts at all hours of the day. He had done his part. He had reported the object, alerted the authorities, and watched as experts had taken over the investigation. But now all he could do was wait. Wait for answers. Wait for someone to tell him what had happened to the object, what it truly was, and why it had been hidden under that bridge. The quiet town Mark lived in had returned to its usual routine. The local news had covered the event, but the reports were vague. They mentioned a mysterious object being found and that experts had been called in, but there were no details. No one knew exactly what it was or what had been discovered. Mark felt like he was in a strange limbo, caught between the ordinary world he knew and the mystery that seemed to be slowly slipping out of his reach. Mark hadn't heard anything more from the authorities or the experts. The radio silence was deafening. No one had contacted him to let him know what had happened to the object. No one had updated him on the investigation. It was as though the object had just vanished into thin air. One morning, Mark received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end sounded official. "Mr. Davies?" the voice asked. "This is Officer Harris from the local police department. We need you to come in for a statement regarding the object you found under the bridge." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Finally, an update. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping that the silence would end. "Of course," Mark said quickly, eager to hear what had happened. When do you need me? We can meet this afternoon, Officer Harris said. Please come by the station at 3 p.m. We'll fill you in on what we've learned. Mark agreed and hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The waiting was finally over. He had so many questions, and now it seemed like he was going to get some answers. The hours before his appointment felt long. Mark couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept racing back to the object, the strange feeling he had when he first saw it, and the events that followed. What had they found inside it? Was it really some kind of high-tech device, or had they just stumbled upon something that no one had ever expected? At 3 p.m., Mark walked into the police station, his stomach in knots. He was greeted by Officer Harris, who led him into a small meeting room. The room was plain, with a simple table in the middle and a few chairs around it. Harris offered him a seat, but Mark couldn't sit still. He was too anxious to hear what had been uncovered. Mr. Davies, Officer Harris began, his voice calm but serious. I'm sure you're wondering what happened after the object was taken from the bridge. I'm here to give you an update, but I need you to understand that this information is classified. We're sharing it with you because you were the one to find the object, and we believe it's important that you're aware of what we've learned. Mark nodded, his heart pounding. I understand, he said, his voice low. Harris paused for a moment before continuing. The object you found is unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's not military, it's not space debris, and it's not from any known scientific project. We've had a team of experts, including engineers and physicists, examine it. What we've discovered is extraordinary. Mark leaned forward, his curiosity intensifying. Extraordinary how? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris took a deep breath. It appears that the object is a type of advanced technology, something that could be centuries ahead of anything we currently have. It's not a weapon, but it seems to be some sort of power source or energy generator. We're still trying to understand the full extent of its capabilities. The material it's made from is unlike anything we know, and the technology inside it. Well, it doesn't match anything from any government or private sector. It's almost as if it comes from a completely different time or place. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an old piece of forgotten equipment. This was something much bigger, something that could change everything. So what does that mean? He asked. What does it do? We don't know yet, Harris replied. We've only just started to scratch the surface of its potential. There are still many unknowns. But the technology seems to operate on principles we don't fully understand. The object appears to have been dormant for a long time, but it's possible that it could be activated somehow. We're bringing in more specialists to study it, and we've already contacted government agencies who might be able to provide more insight. Mark felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The object was more than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just some odd piece of forgotten tech, it was something far more profound. The thought of it being centuries ahead of anything the world knew was both exhilarating and terrifying. And what's going to happen to it? Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. For now, Harris said, it's being kept in a secure facility. We're treating it as highly sensitive material. No one outside of the experts and the government officials has access to it. As for what will happen in the future, we're not sure yet. We're still gathering information, and we need to be cautious. Mark nodded slowly, trying to process everything he had just heard. The object was far more important than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a curiosity or a strange find. It was a potential breakthrough in science and technology. But what else could be hidden in the world? And who had placed it there under the bridge? Before he could ask more questions, Harris spoke again. I know this might be overwhelming, but I want to thank you for your role in all of this. If you hadn't found the object, we might not have discovered its significance. We'll keep you updated as things progress, but for now, I need you to stay quiet about what you've learned. This information is classified, and we need to control the narrative. Mark sat back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of pride mixed with unease. He had uncovered something that had the potential to change the world, but he was also aware of how dangerous that knowledge could be. He wasn't sure what to think or feel. Part of him was excited by the discovery, but another part of him felt nervous about what might happen next. I understand, Mark said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts inside his head. As Mark left the police station, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He finally had some answers, but the mystery was far from over. The object under the bridge was just the beginning of something much larger, something that could change everything. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever happened next, he would be forever connected to this extraordinary discovery. He walked away from the station, the sun now low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. The questions were far from answered, but for the first time in days, Mark felt a sense of clarity. He had done his part, and now it was time to watch and wait. The world was about to change, and he had a front-row seat to it all. A week had passed since Mark had met with Officer Harris. Life had slowly returned to normal, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The object he had found under the bridge was still a mystery, and despite the information Harris had shared, there was still so much left unknown. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the technology, the strange symbols, the potential it held. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the object again, lying there in the water, as if waiting to be discovered. The authorities had kept a tight lid on the details. News reports were still vague, and no new information had been released to the public. Mark had tried reaching out to Officer Harris several times, but his calls went unanswered. It was as though the investigation had entered a state of secrecy, and Mark was left standing on the outside, just as curious as everyone else. But then, one afternoon, Mark received another call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Officer Harris again. "Mr. Davies," Harris said, his voice more serious than before, "I need you to come down to the station. We've got more information to share with you." Mark's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected to hear from Harris again. Could this be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? Mark agreed to meet Harris at the station, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. What could they have discovered since the last time they spoke? When he arrived at the police station, Harris was waiting for him. He led Mark to the same small meeting room where they had spoken before. This time, there was no small talk. Harris sat down across from Mark and folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Davies, we've made significant progress in the investigation," Harris began, "and I want to fill you in on what we've learned." Mark leaned forward, his heart racing. "What's the latest?" "What have you found?" Harris looked at Mark with a measured expression, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The object you found under the bridge is not from any known source. It's not military, it's not a piece of old technology, and it's not something that belongs to any government agency. We've done more testing, and we've consulted with experts from various fields. What we've discovered is startling." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. The object wasn't just some abandoned piece of equipment. It was something entirely different, something that had been hidden away for reasons they couldn't yet understand. "We've traced the material that the object is made from," Harris continued. "And it's unlike anything on Earth. The elements used in its construction don't match anything in our known periodic table. We've sent samples to laboratories for further analysis, and we're working with a team of top scientists who believe that the object may not even be from our planet." Mark's breath caught in his chest. "What are you saying? You're telling me the object might be from somewhere else?" Harris nodded slowly. "Yes, we don't have definitive proof yet, but the preliminary results suggest that the technology could be extraterrestrial. It's possible that the object came from another world, or even from the future. But we're still in the early stages of investigating how it works and what its true purpose is." Mark's mind was spinning. He had never imagined something like this. What had he uncovered? Could it really be from another world? Another time? The possibilities were endless and yet still so mysterious. "We're taking precautions, Mr. Davies," Harris said, noticing the shock on Mark's face. "The object is now in a highly secure facility. We've contacted other countries, and agencies involved in space exploration are being informed. It's crucial that we proceed carefully. The implications of this discovery are enormous." Mark could hardly believe what he was hearing. A part of him still couldn't fully grasp the enormity of the situation. He had found something that could change everything, a discovery that might rewrite history. "How long will it take to figure out what it is?" Mark asked, his voice quieter now. "It could take months, even years," Harris replied. "There are still so many unknowns. We're working with the best minds in the world, but this is uncharted territory. We're not sure where this will lead, but we're doing everything we can to understand it. We'll keep you updated as things progress." Mark sat back in his chair, processing the information. The weight of the discovery was starting to sink in. The object he had found wasn't just some strange artifact. It was something that had the potential to change the course of human history. "I can't believe this," Mark said finally. I found it by accident. How is it even possible?" Harris looked at Mark with a slight smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Davies, the most significant discoveries happen by chance. You've played a key role in this, and we wouldn't have gotten this far without your actions. You've given us a piece of the puzzle, but there's still so much more to uncover." Mark thought about those first moments when he had discovered the object, floating there in the water beneath the bridge. He had no idea what it was, but he had known it was important. Now he was beginning to understand just how important. "What's next?" Mark asked, his voice filled with both excitement and fear. "What happens now?" Harris leaned forward, his expression serious. "We continue our investigation. We'll study the object, analyze its technology, and try to learn how it works. But we also need to keep this information as secure as possible. We're working closely with international authorities, and we're going to make sure that we handle this with the utmost care." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had stumbled upon something incredible, something that was beyond anything he had ever imagined. And now it was up to the world's experts to figure out what to do with it. "Mr. Davies," Harris added, "there's something else. We've been in contact with experts from various fields, and they believe that there may be more of these objects out there. The one you found is just the beginning. We don't know how many others exist or where they might be. But we're going to find out, and when we do, the world will never be the same." Mark's heart raced. More of these objects. If there were more out there, then what else was waiting to be discovered? The thought sent a chill down his spine, but it also filled him with a sense of awe. The world was on the brink of something huge, something that could change everything. As he left the police station later that day, Mark couldn't help but look at the world around him differently. The ordinary things in life, the people, the places, the small details that made up his world, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the mystery that lay ahead. He had uncovered something so much bigger than himself, and now he was part of something much larger. The adventure was far from over. Mark didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: the discovery under the bridge had been just the beginning. The world was about to be changed forever.